So on my way over here, I was trying to remember when we first met, and I can't, because it's been a while. But we were just talking to Karin, and you two went to graduate school together, and I think we met at Anthony Pearson's house.
Could be.
Sometime around 20 years ago. And so since that time, I've come to know your work, and I'm really excited to talk about this new body of work for a lot of reasons. One of which is because it really was made primarily during the pandemic. Or I should say, I guess, the early days, the heart of the pandemic. Before we get too deep into everything that kind of goes into your practice overall and into how you conceive the projects, I think it would be great to start by talking about actually the technical stuff, because your work can be a little mind-bending. It can look, at first glance, sometimes very naturalistic, and perhaps almost even documentary, but the closer you look, the more you start to see that perhaps that's not the case. But I think with this body of work, it's a little more evident that you are, as a photographer and as an artist, making interventions with the images and using photographic technologies that might not be familiar to everybody. So I think it would be helpful to kind of lay the groundwork for how your work is actually.
Yeah, okay, cool. Well, I've got one to look at and point at, so I'm a gestural person.
And also, please, come closer and feel free to look at work like while we're talking and ask questions as we go.
Yeah.
Just a tiny backtracking. So since 2012 or so, I moved in the direction of using this technology. It's basically, easiest way to put it is that the images are often composites. So in this case, the compositing happens on sort of in two places. So each half is composited, but within each half, those are composites. So the best way to put it is that I walk to the very end of the pier, first thing in the morning, on the top, and the device I'm using basically points to one section and makes rows and columns of individual pictures. And that unfolds over a period of 10 minutes. I'll do another one, so I spend about an hour basically creating the images at the top, go take my gear, walk to the bottom, and do essentially the same thing. So what you're seeing is basically, in a nutshell, a kind of like cohesive image that appears to be a moment in time, but is really a couple of hours compressed. So lots of things happen. The light changes, animals come in and out of the frame, the ocean's constantly moving, and so the intent is to create something that feels very initially cohesive, but it doesn't take long to look at them and figure out that there's several things that are falling apart spatially and temporally. So, for instance, the position that the body would have to be in to make this picture look very strange where they would be. And also there are two vanishing points and a lot of things going on. Yeah, that's the short version of how they're made.
Okay. And so the device that you're referring to, that's the Peipon.
The Peipon.
And how does it know the parameters that it should span?
So basically at the beginning, you essentially just, so if I was photographing this scene, you just point to what you think of as the general top left and bottom right, and it just registers those 2 points. And then the loader knows how far to overlap where to start. That's basically all it is.
So that's production.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about post-production generally in your practice, and then maybe more specifically in this.
Post-production part, some of it's just really boring, basically trying to figure out how to make these things work. I mean, a lot of it is that, but to be honest, like in the last several years, because that part of making photographs can be kind of tedious and technical, I've actually gotten much more playful and to entertain myself, essentially, is that, like, how I treat. So what what I notice in these spaces is that obviously you see birds in a lot of places. So I'm now like, I don't remember half the time if I photographed a bird separately and placed it into the photograph that you're looking at, or whether the same bird has moved within the time that I'm making the take a pan. So you may see like 3 pigeons that are 1 pigeon, but all that is just riffing at that time. I'm literally moving things around to make the most exciting, entertaining experience for me. So we brought it to the very beginning, which is really important, and I think that's kind of the part that I'm not even totally sure what I think about it. But I feel like this work is both documentary and not documentary. Like I want these to be some kind of historical record because these appears to change and fall apart and burn. And so I feel like I'm coming out of a very strong documentary tradition, but I, at the same time, have like 0 reference for an unaltered documentary. So I'm gonna have a strange ethics that I bring to it, which is that I don't feel any responsibility to the world or empathy to make something that's truthful, but at the same time, I kind of want to make these things that are records of the world.
Definitely. And I think it's an important acknowledgement of subjectivity in photography. That, photography has this, history of debate around objectivity in the media, whether objectivity is even possible. And so I think that your latitude that you bring to altering, intervening, in the picture, however you want to call it, really allows for your subjectivity to come into the point of view, into the conversation, where it's not quote-unquote straight documentary. And just to refer to the book a little bit, I did an interview with Amir for this publication, and there is some interesting conversation that we get into about that a little bit in the book, about how your work might actually be self-portraiture at the end of the day, in some way. So we can get into a little bit more of that. But another thing about post-production, I'm glad we're starting here because one of my favorite instances in the exhibition is in this photograph, which is there's a snap machine here, it's like an ice cream machine, and Amir has removed, I think, from all of the images, any trace of text. But he decided to keep the graphics of the ice cream. So there are all these floating ice cream sandwiches and ice cream cones and things, but there's no indication of, here's the snack machine. There's no text. Next to this as well, there's, a bathroom sign that probably actually has text on it. There's a marquee here. Yes. So can you tell us a little bit about your decision to remove any text from these images?
Yeah. I think that there's a couple things. I think that part of it is just about, part of it is just about desire. Like, I imagine these places, and there is a kind of sense of idealizing them. But the bigger thing is that I think the text, logos, branding, kind of anything, is incredibly powerful. To me, if I see it, it often takes me out of the experience of looking at something and into thinking about that text. So even if the text is, this big and it says something, you're going to pay kind of special attention to that the way that you wouldn't if it were like this title, which is also that size. You want to expect that in a way that's kind of bodily and experiential and about observation. Whereas, if it says like some name of a brand, that's one part. The other part is I'm kind of interested in these, like, I've been doing this for several years now. Like, if this had a sign that says something, instead of trying to completely remove it, I'm much more interested in kind of making these monochromes within the photograph and be a kind of believable blank sign, partially that we can kind of project, and you might imagine like what it might say or what it might stand for. But yeah, that's kind of why I approach it that way. And again, some of it is just a matter of not habit so much, but like a way of working that I feel like has now kind of developed as my way of working. So I'll kind of continue to do that.
So the text is all removed.
Yeah.
We don't see any human figures in any of these images. And I suppose that is partially because it's very early in the morning and there probably aren't all that many people out. But do people sometimes show up in your photographs and then you remove them in post-production?
Yeah, so you'll notice, should we walk?
Sure, yes.
Let's go.
We'll follow you.
Okay.
Put this away. And maybe I can come back to switch. Let's see.
We allow to my ear. It's usually either I'm completely by myself or if there are other people.
There was a short period of time where I was going to the Newport Pier, which is there at 500 and fishing, just out of some interest, I don't know, but it was that time in the morning. So I had a little bit of a kind of interesting, I felt like there was a similarity in what we were doing, what myself and what the fishermen were doing. It was like this idea of capturing something. And so there are often in a picture like this that probably, if I remember, would be like 2 or 3 families, sometimes families, sometimes solo, and they're moving, right? So when I would get back, it would be sometimes like bodies cut in half. There'd be, half of the fishermen might be caught here and then moved or they moved here. So removing all of them, but I was very interested in their gear. And so they're always going to be their gears. It's visually interesting, right? It's a little bit more like something in the image that's about human presence, about
Well, I think it's a little similar to what you were describing about language. If we see a word in a field, then our mind will be immediately drawn to the meaning of that word. Why is that word there? What is it trying to signal to me? Similarly, we will, pick out a face or form. I even do this when I'm walking in the backcountry. I think I see people. It's like, I think we're wired to look for other people and other creatures.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that the text and the human creatures have that draw to the eye, and you're asking us as viewers to look at something else, to look at this environment.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. I think that's exactly it. Is that we not only want to, when there is a human being, we want to talk about an area, we want to talk about, what that person might be like. And I think that maybe that's tapping into a kind of interest that I probably have about sort of universality, universality of experience, the human experience, and not a particular kind. Part of this is about escape, right, about the pandemic. I chose these locations because they feel like the furthest place you can go to get away. And, a lot of it's about solitude and about, I think a lot of things that I'm interested in photographing or making photographs of have to do with just tapping into my own experience of being someplace, hiking. I know one of the reasons Corrina talked about, I talked a lot of people enjoy the outdoors and hiking. This is like, if you're somewhere by yourself and you kind of come around a bend and you don't know what you're going to encounter, and it could be a tree, it could be, a mountain, and just that sort of moment of like you dealing with scale and presence of something. I think I'm interested in that. I mean, part of it is this like idea about the sublime.
a big one. But I think it's an interesting segue to something that I've been thinking about. I think about looking at all of your work, but there's something about this project in particular that it feels like a practice inside the practice. You have a lot of practices. I know that the concept of practice is very, integral to your life. As an artist, you have a practice. You have a yoga practice, a meditation practice. You have an intellectual inquiry practice. That encompasses art and spiritual traditions, global spiritual traditions. And this project, but also many of your projects, have a kind of set of circumstances that you seem to map out and then show up for those circumstances, which in a way is a practice. So I'm curious about when you're conceiving of a project, how do the rules get set? Are they all in place before you start making any pictures, or do you kind of let things evolve as you show up for that project?
Yeah, it's somewhat different for everybody, but I talk about this one. Part of what's in my mind when I'm thinking about a subject that I'm going to interrogate for a year or 18 months, it almost always ends up being somewhere around that time, is like, where can I go that has sort of a degree of variation and where I can show up with a kind of process or system that's in place, but there's going to be variation within that system. So these came about in a very organic way. I was thinking about the underneath structure only of the piers, and so I just went and photographed one here where I live and spent a day, didn't really like what I was getting, went back and was doing some post-processing, went back to another one and actually photographed a Newport pier, and when I was finished with underneath, a little bit discouraged, thinking I don't know how I'm going to do anything with this work, is I just decided to go to the top, and I sort of looked at the building and got that to be good too. Just really, when I got to the end, I just realized that this sort of structure that was there didn't have any signage, which is kind of interesting. Like, you can actually see it says Newport Pier Corrina there, but I realized it wasn't there. So it was almost ready-made for me. Like, all of the signage had already been taken away, so it was kind of perfect, actually, as the first image. So when I got that home, I didn't think about this at all. When I started working with both images on a computer, it is really an organic thing. At some point, I sort of looked at the top and bottom, and I don't know if I can pull that off. And the discovery really is the edge, what I like to call it, the edge. And that, getting that to work is what, even though they do fall apart spatially, we'll look at them very long, it's what makes them, initially believable. And so that became a process where I needed to kind of figure out how to do the edge in each one. But the other thing that's important that you brought up, I think is maybe more interesting, is this idea of kind of sustaining practice. The finished work is very important to me, but honestly, like, what makes it an art practice for me is a very experiential one. It's like, I really love that I could sort of map out these piers from Southern California to Central California and go show up, and I knew that system would be the same. I could show up at dawn, I could walk to the end, I could make the picture, whatever was there, and I could walk underneath it. So I could do this thing that was all about like standing in some place and experiencing something the same and different every time. So it is very, very meditative. And the bottom part of every condition you can imagine, low tide, high tide. Some of them are really sketchy and precarious. But so there's a sort of challenge built in, but the parameters to me kind of build themselves. Like there isn't that many choices. Once you once you get there. So, and really it's about sustained observation, like standing someplace for an hour while the light is changing and the world is unfolding, birds are coming in and out. It's very, it's great. It's really optimistic. I mean, that's another thing is I have to say, like, during the pandemic, I was feeling like everybody, this sort of pessimism and thinking about how I wanted to make art during a time that was like that. And I wanted to move as far away from anything social that I could. Like, I wanted to make stuff with it was really about like existential escape, like as romantic as it can get, to be honest, and positive.
Yeah, it's so important to talk about that, but you also just started talking about something that I think is so important, which is, of course, the title of the exhibition, which is On Being Here. On Being Here, which is important, but then also I'm looking at my phone because I want to remember the quote. So Amir wrote a text that accompanies this exhibition and also recorded it as a sound piece that has a soundtrack of recordings made during the process of photographing one or more, like how many?
The soundtrack?
Yeah.
I went after I wrote the text to back here actually and recorded ambient sound.
Okay.
And just whatever, dropped it in.
Great.
Yeah.
So it's a really wonderful piece, and you can access it through a QR code at the desk, and it's also on Amir's website. And in the text, he says at least once, the only place to go is here. And I actually am getting very emotional thinking about this, because it's so like obvious, but also probably one of the most difficult things to do for many people is to realize that wherever you go, there you are, right? Like the hokey bumper sticker. But it is so much about, it's a truism, but it is also a very spiritual idea. That wherever you go, you are here. And that is what's going on in every single person at any time.
Yeah.
These tiny universes that make up the larger universe. So that to me also links very much with your interest in global spiritual traditions, your own spiritual practices, and you know, the idea of being able to use art as a way to also communicate that, to give audiences a way to access that for themselves potentially. I don't, there's not a question.
It's fine. Yeah, some of this stuff is a little ineffable, but I think that, so when I almost always write about work that I'm making for myself, and just a little bit helps me kind of clarify things, but with this particular piece of writing that Corrina's talking about, I wrote it and I would sort of like read it in my head, and I thought, wow, there's so many different ways to make this, to inflect different parts. So it's just the title of the show, On Being Here. It's really on being here. Like that's a big difference, you know, that little thing. So that's what helped me decide to make this audio piece. And I just really wanted to kind of have it be in my voice. And so I think it's actually really weird that I make photographs, because photographs are sort of run completely counter to being present all the time. It's this practice about looking back at something that doesn't exist and sort of longing and nostalgia, and I think I'm just interested in finding a way to make that a little bit more complicated. And so like to me, I think about time in this work and space as like, I talk about cubism, weirdly enough, sounds so old-fashioned, but there is this desire to kind of create something that seems cohesive, but is really talking about time in an expansive way, which is what being here is.
Yeah.
It's not stuck. And so this idea of not being stuck or something that's like changing, and these places are in complete precarious nature. They look really strong and stable, and this photograph hanging on the wall in one sense is like stuck, but it's of something that is totally different right now. It's completely different than it appears. That building won't be there probably at all in 5 years, right? So there's this like wanting to talk about that, but yeah, I don't know if I have more to say about the present thing. It's complicated.
I'll interject one thing that, from my point of view on that, which to me it feels like you might think that maybe photography is somehow, antithetical to what you're feeling out with presence, but I think maybe that's what I was getting at by asking the question about practice, about showing up, essentially setting a sort of like conceptual framework and a structure and set of rules so that you can then show up for the practice. You were also talking about observation, how, this work is different than a photograph where, the shutter clicks for a fraction of a second, right? These are long, this takes a lot of time to make. So there is duration, there's experience, there is presence that gets distilled into this image, and it also is time for you to be present,
Right.
and observing, and whether that's your external surroundings or your internal nature. Okay, so maybe we should look at another picture and talk about the edge and also about the birds.
Oh,
Maybe
yeah.
we could look at the one with Karen.
Okay.
Just follow here. Just follow me. And get a good view of
Yeah.
I'll find it. Help me find a good view. And just stand there before the bush.
So I would say maybe if we could move back again a little bit to the technical stuff with this one. Come on in, everyone. So I would say maybe if we could move back again a little bit to the technical stuff with this one. Come on in, everyone. So I led Amir to this image because the birds are so wonderful and so improbable, and I also think that all of them have so much kind of sharpness and clarity to them, that there's something about this one where like the light just kind of has this glint and sharpness, but there's also movement, of course, with the ocean, and we have the edge, as you're referring to it, this horizontal plane that divides every one of the images in this body of work. So I'm just putting all those things on the table, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Okay, I'll start with, I guess it's about the birds. I don't think it's necessary to back up too much, but the last body of work with these concrete skate parks that I was photographing, I noticed when I was in those spaces that particularly crows and seagulls just happen to always be present. And so someone actually pointed out why, and I think they were right. There's always trash cans there, so they're kind of scavengers. So I thought that's, and I thought of those birds as being the most boring, but great birds. So I made this conscious effort to always include birds in those pictures, whether it's there at the moment I took the picture or not. And that's sort of important because to me, whether this is up again about this kind of compression of time, it's completely unimportant if this heron happened to be standing there the moment the camera was pointing to. That heron was standing somewhere at some moment, so it's there, like that's it. Same with, so to me, whether it's composited, it's all fair game. Like I did make the photograph of this thing in space and time. And so to me, there's almost like always an artificiality built into a photograph, and I just maybe embracing it as much as I possibly can. Same with
the way that the waves are moving in and out. You know, this one is breaking, and it's not breaking anymore, but it did break, I promise. It broke and it came in and out. And this is happening throughout. So I just treat these things as such, like kind of, like I said, fair game, and decided to do that. What do I say with it? There's sort of a process involved where I figured out as I was doing it is that when I finished photographing the scene at the top, I just take my cell phone out and whatever ground that pier is made of, I walk across like a crazy person and photograph the ground like 10 times. And then I just keep those cell phone pictures, and when I'm doing my post-production, I create the edge out of those cell phone pictures. So it's always matching the space where I made the original photograph. There may be a couple exceptions here or there. But because it's so much pushed into the foreground, it's naturally out of focus. And actually the out of focus, I experimented a lot. The out of focus quality is what makes it feel like you're really looking into that space. If it were sharp, it would be something perceptual.
That makes sense to me. I mean, there's that kind of that illusion that you need to be convinced, but also to suspend disbelief, which are, I think, slightly different things. So the divide, this horizontal divide across all of these landscape photographs that are portrait orientation creates this kind of double landscape in a way, where like the ocean below and the sky above. I don't really have a question here, but it makes me think about time, and it makes me think about like alternative experiences of time, basically, kind of like an idea about non-linear time, that stories are happening on parallel tracks everywhere all the time. Simultaneity is constant, and it's almost as though for me, when I look at these, that I am allowed to see into two stories that are happening at the same time that I shouldn't necessarily see normally. And that's a very, they're also, you know, these portrait-oriented compositions are divided into two landscapes. So, I don't have a question, but it interests me.
Yeah, I think that part of it is like really linked to maybe a tradition of painting where artists try to figure out ways to paint in a way that was much more like you experience life than something painted kind of realistically. So like the way the mechanics looking at, you know, fruit or something. And I guess that's partially what I'm interested in, is like making something that is like the experience of spending a couple hours at dawn in this location. That's maybe which is what memory feels like. You think about, you know, the last time you went someplace, or what it was like to spend a couple hours somewhere. All of the things, the pieces, kind of end up in one spot in your brain. But of course they were separated by lots of time.
Right. So, I just want to ask you some more questions. One is about California and one's about artists, and then I'll open it up. So you're born and raised in California. As far as I know, all of the work that I know of yours has been made in California. You are, you know, you're a skateboarder, surfer, a punk music aficionado. There are so many sort of like you're a photographer, and there's a incredible, complicated tradition of photography in California. So I'd love to hear what role California plays, you know, in your life as an artist, in your work? Is it incidental? You know, is it just where you happen to be here?
Yeah. I mean, some of it is, yeah. The shortest answer is yes. It's like, for me to sustain some kind of ongoing practice, I've never been the kind of person who thinks that I need to go to a faraway place to make something interesting photographically. I think that just comes through my education and, you know, how I worked with when I was first learning photography, are people who have sustained engagement with the place around them. I guess I'm also a firm believer that, you know, a lot of my work has to do with things that aren't there now. And part of that's where I grew up, where I grew now in place. It's not that exciting. But, you know, I think I have a particularly, I would just say, an unusual relationship to this Southern California. So it's like, my mother's from Midwest Minnesota. My father immigrated here from Egypt when he was 20. They met in Minnesota. They came to California for work. And so, and then the town I grew up in, Beaumont, where maybe some people know, it's like 10,000 people at the time. And cherry orchards, and it's pretty rural. And my family's sort of heritage makeup was pretty unusual, I would say. I was the only kid in school who had that particular background. And I feel like there's so much about a kind of hybrid part of my identity that informs the way I look at the landscape, the way I look at subjects, the way I approach technology. You can see that I'm as far away from a purist in any way as you can imagine. I'm just not, it's not part of my makeup. I tend to be interested in blending ideas, Eastern thought, Western thought, you know, so that's just kind of who I am through. And so it's becoming more pronounced, I think, as time goes on with my work, and less just this idea of just kind of hybrid.
Great. So, lots of complicated ideas coming all together in these bodies of work that, you know, can seem one way on first glance and then allow for so much investigation. And I think the way your approach to books is really similar to this. You know, photographs, of course, they're amazing on the wall. They look amazing. The scale, you know, allows us to really kind of access them in a different way. You know, very immersive kind of books that you've made. You know, photographs are very conducive to, of course, you know, tactile kind of medium as well. And you know, you use the book format more than once to investigate space in a different way than you can in two-dimensional photograph. And one of the really cool things I think about the way you use books is that, of course, a book is a durational object. It involves our experience of time to look through and read the book. But you also have really experimented with the space of the book, the physical space of the book. So let's take a look at Building and Becoming on the table, because I think it would be...
I had an earlier design, but what it is the title wraps around the entire book, and it's basically my work split into two halves, which are roughly the natural landscape and the built landscape. So I was looking at all my work and sort of dividing up the work, like, oh, this would go here, this would go there. And very quickly, it wasn't that easy. So at some point, I was like, I made this 3D software, but it looks like a piece of wood you find on the beach. Maybe that's in the natural part, the becoming part of the book, and you know, vice versa. So I like that the categories kind of fall apart, but in essence, it's a double gatefold. It's a double gatefold. The building part of the work is on this side, the becoming is on this side, and it's not organized chronologically at all. And the whole idea is that the experience is the kind of durational thing, like Corrina was talking about, of looking through the book, is that you can never kind of predict the combinations that you're going to have from left and right, because every time you look through it, it would be probably different, or you could focus on one side or the other side. And so it's very intuitive the way it's put together. Actually, my daughter, who's 16, helps me a lot with things like this. I lay out prints all over the ground, and I say what makes sense, and she's fantastic. She helps me a lot with that kind of thing. She's very, very naturally good at stuff like that. And so it's really formal in a lot of ways. It's like, you know, things that just make sense formally. And then what got really fun, I should say, I worked with this incredible designer named Chris Svensson, who was way more patient than anybody should be working with me on something like this. But we had so much fun. Basically, we got to the part where we were doing the essays, and I told him, you know, nobody reads these stupid essays. Like Corrina and I did this 18-page interview, and then Walter Ben Michaels and his partner Jennifer made a really beautiful academic essay at the end. No one's going to read this, so let's have fun with the text. And so what we ended up doing was creating the text that reads across all four. So to view it, to actually read through the text, if this side is closed, you're going to read page 1 and page 2, and then try to flip, and it's going to be page 5 and page 6. So in order to read it, you have to read across all four. Then you sort of, this wasn't pre-planned, but I was thinking as the book was becoming very evident, that, you know, in terms of this kind of hybrid thing I was talking about, and a little bit of an autobiographical nod, is that, you know, books written in my father's native language, Arabic, would open the way this side does, and books written in English would open the way this side does. So I sort of felt like I was giving a little nod to them as well. So I just like this. I'm cross-dominant. So I do a lot of things left-handed, but some things right-handed, and I think a lot of artists do. So it's nothing unique, but I was thinking about this, this kind of experience. There's also, I just saw Corrina. We went to graduate school with someone named Jennifer Nelson, who, this is just a little side note, did these amazing pieces in grad school that all had to do with doing things with both hands. So she served spaghetti to all of us and made us eat with both hands. It was amazing. We went to school with really great artists, so that's probably key.
Great class.
Yeah. So that's the book. It's it's got 2 essays at the end and open, and you need a big table.
Yes, this is the perfect size. Thank you so much for your amazing work and sharing all these insights with us today. Does anyone have questions? Conversation, Susan.
Hi, Susan. Can you talk a little bit about the grid in your work? Because it's kind of interesting to see that play out in this work in particular. And not just the horizontal edge, but all of the verticality and all of the horizontality in all of the images.
Mm-hmm.
Super interesting to me, because I know, you know, just in terms of the seriality and the measures and what the grid does for you, what it means to you, like architecturally and also formally. Or maybe it doesn't.
No, it's good. It's good. I think that it's like a subject that's so it's probably so familiar to me that I just don't even interrogate it so much. So I mean, it is important. Like, I think that in someone like the Beschers, or in a lot of work that's documentary, it's a signal of kind of truth telling in some ways. The Beschers uniform rules that they give themselves, always overcast, always in the same exact format. You know, it's about veracity. It's about signaling like this is what we're doing. That's sort of like a bug, like a bug specimen on you know, it's that. So for me, I'm sort of using that vocabulary because I know it has such weight, but of course they're completely fictional. but they're not completely fictional. But I don't think about the grid. I mean, I don't know what I would think about it. Other than it's like a formula that's, I mean, everybody's got to tap into something art historically. I'm just tapping into something that's
Does the viewfinder on the Gigapan have a grid?
No, you're basically just not really. It's actually what you make with that image is very untethered. It's just like kind of you're sort of all over the place and it's warped and yeah, I can think of it. It's much more like when they take the globe and kind of make, it feels like that. So this is all created after the fact, all the kind of symmetry and perfect coordinates is all happening after the fact. It's probably like a type A thing, to be honest. I'm a Virgo and I'm a type A. Maybe
Well,
that's
I
why.
wonder just because it's really present in this work more than in other work. I was wondering if
Just to follow from Susan's question, before I go there, what the Gigapan gives you, is it more three-dimensional than what we're seeing?
What do you mean?
Meaning, are you flattening and paralleling to the picture plane?
Okay, that's really important actually. This tiny photo nerd stuff, you asked for it.
Yes.
Okay, so in a traditional wide-angle view or a fisheye view or something like that, you're going to get a ton of distortion and everything in the center is going to look really small and far away. And everything on the edges is going to be very exaggeratedly big.
Okay.
The opposite is true is in a telephoto lens where you're zooming in, everything is flat. So the lens that's on these is telephoto, so it is flattening space, but the view you're seeing is wide. So it's literally another hybrid. Like,
sure.
I'm very close to this building, way closer than you can imagine. So I'm really photographing an incredibly wide view, but because every individual image is flattening this pylon to that pylon, then what you're seeing is a bit of a strange, like it doesn't look like you couldn't make, even if you wanted to, you couldn't make these look this way with any kind of single lens.
Gotcha. So yeah, because I was thinking about what you were saying, Susan, in terms of the grid, and I think you're talking about compositional organization on the picture plane, and maybe less so to do, or both with perspective. And I receive these, and sorry, this isn't to be parochial. As an architect, I receive these more as drawings by other means that put you much more in touch with the Renaissance, actually, as well as modernism, in my field, as critics have commented on, let's say, the work of Mies van der Rohe, where there are paradoxical symmetries. You've got bilateral symmetries, you've got multiple horizons, you're stacking, it's frontal, it's sectional at the same time, and other than the ones where we sense tilt a lot, think things are brought parallel to the picture plane in ways that you mentioned the sublime there, truly uncanny, they give me goosebumps. And thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation that was incredibly enriching.
Thanks for being here.
I'm thinking about painting in relation to these, and I think it's very interesting in person, and also the two reasons from this day. I was thinking about the lectures too, so you're thinking about me in relation to this archival practice, but I think you're funnier. And so I think keep thinking about the epoch in the 80s, painting the chairs, a lot of chairs, and couldn't sit on them because but the perspective copying was using about questioning out yourself, like when you see it from different perspectives in relation to modern condition. So it was in relation to painting that I thought was humor, but then sitting there and looking at the surface of the photographs and seeing that they're not shiny. And then you
Yeah, I think about the object quality of these a lot. I guess I feel a little bit like the kind of fetishization of the print surface. I guess it's something I just feel like I've kind of cultivated. But the history of it for me is that it did kind of naturally evolve. So as I was making photographs from 1999 or something through the 2000s, the technology was getting such that I was making larger prints, larger photographs, getting really interested in this kind of like specificity of how much kind of detail I could get and playing with different technologies. And then at some point I made these body of work lifeguard towers, and they're big, they're 60 by 75 inches. And I made them and I was like, so gratifying to make them and look at the prints, and then I sent them to New York. They were framed, and I show up at the gallery and I walk in and all I see is this big reflection of plexiglass. And I was like, ugh. You know, so it really bummed me out because it completely killed everything I loved about it. And so that was it. Like after that, I just, no glass. I want the surface to be the surface I'm seeing when I make them. I want them to feel like they're better and more interesting than something on a screen. This big, you know. So all those things are involved. It's funny you bring up the oblique game. I don't think that's not something I consciously think of, but I think it does relate to this idea of like walking in to see something. You know, painters it's all about surface, and it is this weird thing that like people pretend to not see the reflection in a photograph that's this big, and it's there. It's terrible. It's like shit, you know. So like, why should why should I, have that liability in the work? Yeah.
I'm just curious about why the two sizes. And to dovetail that, a lot of people will only see this on Instagram.
Yeah.
So, and that's like a closest gap. And so how do you work with different ideas of scale?
It's pretty experimental for me. Like I have the privilege of always printing my own work, and I put them up in the studio and play around with scale. And I guess for installation purposes, I think maybe with only one or two exceptions, the work exists in a couple of scales because again, and this is maybe backtracking to some of the things Corrina brought up, is I think that the experience of your body in front of something is really important. So if you're pulled in and pushed back, and there's a dynamism to the installation, it's just something I'm drawn to.
So like these two small images on the side, if they were the size of the ones behind you, you have to keep moving around in the space more. So if you were to hit these somewhere else, you might make them bigger.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, you're also just working with the practicality of like making work and putting it into a space. It's like you can't have everything, but I mean, there is a careful quality to me thinking about the work in the scale.
Custom made for the space. Really.
Yeah. Yes, Charles.
Try to be psychological, then
Do it. I'll try my best.
These are terminus, these are dead ends in the world. They've been moved out beyond where one can walk and live. And then you cut that off, and now it's this isolated ending. So there's that I think is kind of interesting. And then there's the upper and lower, and the upper is uninhabited, and the lower is uninhabitable. And and these are very much, I think, these definitely seduce one into a dream state. I think it parallels the dream state with the removal of text and specific people. I mean, dreams loaded with people, of course, but also when you don't have someone else's person that you have in a dream, you're allowed to enter that space in your own dream. So I guess those are some things I'm thinking about when I look at this. It seems fairly obvious to me that you're quite going there. And you're more of a philosopher So you can take it back into philosophy if you want, but I would sort of like to hear you say something about the subject as we're experiencing. It's a unique subject. It's an iconography that is absolutely specific, and it also parallels older work of yours, houses jutting up, things like that. I like that. There's a real sense of super autonomy and isolation. I don't know, go there where you want to go with them. I'd love to know what your therapist is.
Yeah. That's funny. The psychological part. What to say about that? It's funny because I think that I talked about it a little bit, but well, the tricky thing about that question is that at a certain point I have to not talk about it because it's too personal, right? Like the psychological is really personal, so I'm not going to air my dirty laundry in front of all of you. So there's that part. So I have to be careful about how much I indulge. But I mean, there is this sense that that what I wanted to get at in going to these places for myself was about a kind of it's like how far where can I go, right? During the pandemic and during a lot of social unrest and during a lot of personal problems, there's this sort of there's this sense of wanting to get away, but there's a very particular time where you couldn't. And not only that, you couldn't be social. So the social part, we're all sitting with masks, there's actually it made it so we couldn't be social. So I guess I had to figure out what to do with that, inside and outside. So I just went alone with these places. There's a therapeutic part of art making, as you know. So maybe, I don't know, bad answer.
But the On Being Here title, I think, is kind of both philosophical and psychological. There's an acceptance, I think, that is emotional or psychological about I'm always going to be right here in this head, and I'm also going to be wherever my fingers go. And cultivating that kind of acceptance can, I think there's a psychological framework to that as much as there's a philosophical or spiritual dimension to it too.
Jonathan, what reading suggested is people like this subject, architectural uncanny by Anthony Zimmer. This seems to be halfway wall.
Okay, I don't know.
Freud and the house. What is he on Heinlein? Heinlein and Heinlein are kind of the same thing, which your heart is always displaced from you. Your mind is always displaced from you. And this needs to be an incredible balance that is impossible to achieve by most people. So it's to me a kind of space.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the book, but I guess I think I said this earlier that I think that in a lot of my work there is a desire for kind of idealism. So I'm pretty pretty open about that. Yep.
I just have more of a response to that question.
Cool.
That is kind of what Charles just heard what other people are saying. It's very resonating also that it feels like there's an underworld and an overworld that then they feel like pavilions or temples, and then when you mentioned Renaissance architecture, I think with all the pillars, and I was thinking they feel, some of them feel really passive on the bottom, or like more like still on the bottom, but then that flips. Because then you feel like the waves are moving, or there's like, it feels like the top is like human, it's like man-made, and the bottom is natural, but then it isn't. So it's just interesting because the feeling of like overworld and underworld is really powerful in some of them where there's more like barnacles and kind of more like darkness, feeling in the water, feeling like you're really like under this thing. But just in listening to what you're talking about these like contradictions or things that look one way and then reverse themselves, like it seems to happen a lot like through, like somebody said, verticality and horizontalness, and then I realized that this bottom is very vertical. Anyway, it's just really nice to have the time where you're sort of really absorb it and listen to what you're saying.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, I think that one thing about the underneath section of all of these is it is a place that maybe people have like gone to, but it isn't a place you're like supposed to hang out in. You know, you're not supposed to spend time in that. It's just it's like a functional thing. It's just like the thing that holds up the thing. But in this case, they're really treated as equal. The underworld and overworld. But I love all those references. I mean, I've had people have completely different reads where someone came to the opening and said, "Oh, the bottoms are so feminine and the tops are so masculine." And someone said, "No, that's fucking ridiculous. It's the other way around." I'm into all that. Not that I intended any of it, but I'm into the sort of that cross section. We're seeing something from a point of view that you only understand intellectually, but to see it visually is like uncanny, I guess, as someone said, but just dreamlike or something. But also totally back to this banal thing. It's also just about like how it is. If you walk to the end of the pier and you walk underneath, that's kind of what happens. What happens in your head. Think about those two things. Put them together.
Any last questions or thoughts?
I really appreciate the questions.
So great. Thank you everyone for being here and There are copies of the book you want to look at this one here at the front desk. There was a signing book if you want to go and purchase the book.
That's great.
Shots